Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. I hope you're doing very well. This is a very exciting story. We've got about 28 school kids and 2 teachers are on a camping trip in the Ozarks. There are 4 girls that share one tent together, and they call themselves the Fearsome 4. When they went swimming that night in the lake, which they shouldn't have done, one of the girls, a girl called Philippa, observed something very strange, a creature with yellow eyes and a dark, sultry body. And she does not know whether she actually saw this thing or not, because it's so easy when it's dark out there to assume you're imagining things. So let's see where this story is going to take us, because I think it's going to be quite some story. And let's continue with our story. I could see everybody on this camping trip was absolutely exhausted, without exception. And in truth, I don't think I can remember a time I felt more fatigued. I had muscles that were aching in places that I didn't even know existed. Natalie had informed us, before we retired to our sleeping bags, that she'd be waking us up at 10 past midnight to go for a swim in the lake. I don't mind admitting to you, I was secretly hoping that Natalie would oversleep and fail to wake up. But I was in for a big disappointment. It must have been midnight when I found myself being vigorously shaken around in my sleeping bag. I looked up through groggy eyes, only to see Natalie smiling down at me, with a big grin on her face. Why was it that Natalie seemed totally incapable of being tired like the rest of us? Couldn't she see how dead beat we were? The last thing I wanted right now was to go for a swim in the lake. "Wake up, sleepyhead! It's 10 past 12. We're going swimming in the lake, remember? I took a peek outside our tent. It's beautiful out there. Now get dressed into your swimming costume." Next, it was Laura and Claudia's turn to be shaken wide awake by an ever so enthusiastic Natalie, who was one of those people that could thrive on 4 hours sleep and seemed unable to comprehend how anyone else needed any longer to get some sleep. She seemed to have no comprehension that it had been an exhausting day at the Ozarks, and getting up in the middle of the night to enjoy a midnight swim did not seem desperately exciting right now. But Natalie's ebullience made it almost impossible to refuse her, although Claudia did bitterly complain as she pulled the sleeping bag over her head and said, "Why don't you all go? Leave me here in the tent. I'm just dead beat, I really am." Natalie's infectious ebullience made it practically close to impossible to refuse her, although Claudia did complain as she pulled the sleeping bag right over her head. "Why don't you all go? Leave me here in the tent. I'm dead beat. I need some more sleep," she said. Natalie refused to take no for an answer. She practically scooped Claudia out of her sleeping bag. "I'm not sure I'm up for this, Natalie," Claudia complained. "I've got a bit of a throbbing headache, and I'm dead beat. I'm awfully tired. Please let me sleep a little longer." Natalie raised a brow. "I don't want to listen to your excuses, Claudia. We agreed when we got to the Ozarks we would swim together in the lake in the middle of the night. We won't get another opportunity like this. You can have as much sleep as you like when we get back to school, but out here we need to make the most of every opportunity." "I suppose you're right," Claudia said in resignation, wiping the sleep away from her eyes. "Honestly," chided Natalie, "anyone would think you were doing me a big favour by agreeing to come along with me for a swim. But we're the Fearsome 4, aren't we? This is what we always do. We're a team." Before we knew it, we were all dressed in our bathing costumes and ready to have our midnight swim. "You're not going to regret any of this," Natalie assured us. "Imagine if we went home and wasted this opportunity of swimming in a lake at midnight in the Ozarks under the glittering stars. We would be chastising ourselves, wouldn't we, for being so bone idle? We're making memories here. How many people do you know would wake up at this time of night to enjoy a swim? Everyone in the tents are fast asleep, and we're here having barrels of fun. What could be better than this?" "You know what I think about you, Natalie? You're going into the wrong profession. You shouldn't become a vet," I said sarcastically. "You should be a salesperson or a politician." "What's that supposed to mean?" Natalie giggled. "It means you can sell us anything, like swimming in the lake in the middle of the night when we're dead beat. Not everyone could do that, you know. You mean I can sell snow to an Eskimo? Natalie chuckled. Something like that, I said. Although, come to think of it, the military might suit you a whole lot better. You're a hard taskmaster, Natalie. And my guess is when the soldiers in your battalion are completely spent, you'd make them do 1,000 more sit-ups. Honestly, you're making me sound like a slave driver, Philippa. We're doing this because we're intrepid explorers, are we not? We're the fearsome four. Have you forgotten that? I cannot believe we're actually doing this, said Claudia. We're all so tired, and now we're going for a midnight swim. You have to admit it, it's kind of crazy. Are we completely out of our minds? Let's just say if Miss Greenwich or Mrs. Cooper knew what we were getting up to, we'd be in so much trouble. That's why we're thrill-seekers, said Natalie. We live in the moment, don't we? We're intrepid adventure-seekers. We have reputations to live up to, don't we? I will admit that getting out of my sleeping bag and changing into my swimming costume had been a laborious, tiresome struggle. But I'd got dressed as quickly as I could, so I didn't have to think about what I was doing. My body felt as floppy and uncompliant as a rag doll, and every single muscle in my entire body ached. But somehow, as usual, Natalie had successfully bamboozled us out of our tents. We soon took the short path to the lake, and I will admit, even in my sleepy, somewhat disenchanted state, I was slowly but surely beginning to wake up. By the time we dived into the deliciously cool water of the lake, we were having the time of our lives. I felt invigorated and refreshed. We were playing around like little kids, splashing each other and enjoying the Milky Way stretched out before our heads, reflected in the water, and I will admit it was breathtakingly beautiful, and in that quintessential poignant moment, I can honestly say I regretted absolutely nothing. I would be able to look back on this point in time, in years to come, and remember this very special magical moment, swimming under a galaxy of silvery stars at the dead of night like this. Suffice to say, Natalie was rather full of herself. She couldn't hide the self-satisfied, smug I-told-you-so look on her face. "This is amazing," she said. "I don't know about you, but I wouldn't have missed this for the entire world. Am I right? Or am I right?" she asked. We all had to admit that, as usual, Natalie was absolutely right. The swim in the lake had been absolutely magnificent. We knew the following night we would do it again, and take another dip in these refreshing waters. We needed to make the most of being here at the Ozarks, and I fully intended to enjoy myself thoroughly, for there was not much time left to be around my friends, as the following year was looming around the very next corner. As I was reflecting over this, and my friends were splashing wildly around in the water, that was when I saw him standing there among the trees, staring at us with bright yellow eyes. This thing was so tall and so humongous, and looked to be covered in hair. I saw him so fleetingly as the moonlight spilled across his face, but then I told myself in no uncertain terms that that had to be a trick of the light. I didn't see anything, I persuaded myself. Maybe I am so fatigued from all this physical exertion and all the excitement of being here at the Ozarks that I was making up things in my head like you do when you're dreaming. I decided not to speak of what I thought I'd seen to my friends, because maybe it really had just been a deception on my part. A shifting of shadows, perhaps. That night when we returned to our sleeping bag, I was gripped with a sense of very grave disquiet, as I thought about what I thought I had seen. But before I could reflect on such ruminations, once my head hit the pillow of my sleeping bag, I was out like a light. Needless to say, the following morning, it was a fearsome four's tent that was very quiet, as we all slept in for good reason, and subsequently missed breakfast, but we didn't care. The swim at the lake had made it all worth our while. I think all the other students thought we were a tad lazy, not getting up in time for breakfast, but little did they know that while they were fast asleep in their sleeping bags, we were painting the Ozarks red, like teenagers out on the town. The next day was quite similar to the previous one, with a few discernible differences, you could say. We enjoyed plenty of walking up rugged, steep, sometimes treacherous trails, which was then followed by a stint of fishing and boating in the late afternoon. Needless to say, Miss Greenwich became very possessive over the icebox, never letting it out of her sight. She didn't want the previous incident of last night to be repeated again. I'm glad to say the icebox remained full, and we had a delicious fish dinner that night, cooked on a grill over open flames. And there are no words to describe how good that fish tasted. It literally melted in our mouths like butter. I wish I could say the ghost stories around the fire that night were good, but they were pathetically lame, I'm afraid. So much so that I can barely remember what was said. But stories were invariably told. But what they were, well, your guess is as good as mine. But let's just say, no story could measure up with Blaine's from the previous night. Still, we had a very enjoyable evening, and finally returned to our tents, as we had done the night before, with the same regimental routine. The fearsome four, of course, knew that our evening was not yet over yet. We would enjoy a light sleep, and at 12:10, Natalie would invariably be dragging us out of our sleeping bags. But in a strange way, after our fun in the lake the night before, I was looking forward to another adventure in the cool water of the lake, and so were the rest of us. As can be predicted, in her usual determined form, Natalie began to arouse the sleeping dead from their sleeping bags. It was once again not a task for the faint-hearted to wake us up out of our peaceful slumber. Soon we were rudely disturbed by the piercing abrupt ringtone of Natalie's voice in our ears, telling us to wake up. I was groggy with sleep. The fresh air of the Ozarks had worked its magic on me, and I had fallen under the grip of its enchanting spell. So despite my misgivings about getting up, I was looking forward to this intrepid adventure. It was exciting being the only ones up and about at this time of night. I dare say the camp was hauntingly quiet, airily so. So it would seem the resolute lion within Natalie was not to be tamed, and in her normal robust, persuasive manner, she had masterfully managed to get us out of our sleeping bags and finally dressed into our swimming costumes. We were now trudging off to the lake again, like soldiers being marched off to their vantage points in a war zone. Jokes aside, once we reached the lake and dipped our toes into the sweet cool water and finally dived into the silver resplendence of the lake, we nursed no regret, and for a moment time almost seemed to stand still. All of a sudden, as we were splashing around in the water, I nearly fainted from shock because I saw the figure of Mrs. Cooper charging towards us. Oh my God, she had seen us! She had uncovered our naughty little secret, and now we were as good as dead, I thought. That woman was notorious for being quite strict, and she was going to be furious with us for disobeying the rules of the camp and leaving our tents in the middle of the night to go swimming. My heart was beginning to do flip-flops in my chest, and I could smell trouble brewing in the air as strongly as the wood smoke from the fire earlier on in the evening. Far from appearing irate and furious with us, incongruously Mrs. Cooper seemed very calm and circumspect. She was fully attired in clothes I'd never seen before. She wasn't wearing pyjamas or even a dressing gown, which in itself was decidedly odd. If that wasn't weird enough, she was wearing sunglasses in the middle of the night. Now I ask you, who on earth wears sunglasses when the sky is as black as a pot of ink? This was absolutely extraordinary. I didn't know what to make of it. I began to wonder if Mrs. Cooper could possibly be sleepwalking. Why was she acting so weird? I couldn't be sure, but something felt off. By this time we were all standing up in the lake, our head and shoulders above the water, looking at Mrs. Cooper with faces completely drained of blood. For we had not expected to get caught red-handed like this, doing something we shouldn't be doing. Finally Mrs. Cooper reached the edge of the lake, where the four of us had become as paralysed as wax statues. I held my breath as Mrs. Cooper called out, "Claudia Salazar, I need a word with you, please, in private if I may. Please come out of the water, will you? The rest of you can carry on swimming if you like." We were rather baffled, because Mrs. Cooper was behaving very strangely. You would think the woman would be absolutely incensed with us, but far from it, she was behaving as if a swim in the lake in the middle of the night was perfectly normal. Without a shadow of doubt, I would have expected Mrs. Cooper to have blown a gasket, but then again I reminded myself we were on holiday in the Ozarks after all, so maybe she had chosen to be more lenient with us in the circumstances and turn a blind eye to our mischievous, unorthodox behaviour, which in itself was a big relief. All I could ponder is why did she want to speak to Claudia on her own? Claudia looked rather nervous as she paddled out of the water towards Mrs. Cooper, almost as if she sensed she was in a whole heap of trouble, But why was Mrs. Cooper not laying into the rest of us? I'm not sure what Mrs. Cooper was saying to Claudia. I watched Claudia dry herself while Mrs. Cooper waited for her to put on her sneakers. She was nodding at Mrs. Cooper, but glancing back at us a couple of times with a somewhat bewildered expression on her face. She shrugged her shoulders, almost as if to indicate to us that she didn't have a clue what this was all about. Join the club, I thought. I had no idea what was going on. It's funny, but being caught red-handed doing something you know you shouldn't be doing isn't as thrilling as you would think it would be. It certainly steals your joy. So we gave up on the swim and were heading towards the shore to dry ourselves with our towels, put on our sneakers, and return back to our tents. That was when we watched Mrs. Cooper. She was holding Claudia's hand, and they were walking away from our camp towards the woods. Now this was beyond weird, and seeing Claudia's strange behaviour was mystifying. What on earth were they both doing, I wondered. I persuaded myself that maybe Claudia wanted to answer a call of nature, and Mrs. Cooper was taking her to some shrubbery where she could relieve herself. But why was she holding Claudia's hands in the first place, as if chaperoning a small child? Laura and Natalie were shaking their bodies of excess water and drying themselves vigorously with their towels. I overheard Natalie saying to Laura, "Ooh, that was close, wasn't it? When I saw Mrs. Cooper coming towards the lake, my heart just sank. I thought she was going to blast us. But instead she was so nonchalant about us swimming around in the water at this time of the night. She was actually cool about it. I wonder why Mrs. Cooper wanted to see Claudia. She didn't even seem angry. Don't you think she was acting out of character? She was fully dressed and wearing dark glasses in the middle of the night. How could she possibly see through those things? Who wears dark glasses at night, I ask you?" "It beats me," said Laura. "I can't imagine how she can see anything at all. It's like walking around the place with a blindfold on, don't you think? But as you say, why didn't she lose it with us for swimming in the lake? I thought she was about to have our guts for garters. But like you say, she was so indifferent about us breaking all the rules. Mrs. Cooper, don't get me wrong, I like the woman, but it doesn't take much to set her off into a tangent, and she's always been one of those helicopter teachers that likes everyone to follow the rules step by step. So why she's behaving like this, God only knows." I left my friends discussing the oddity of Mrs. Cooper's strange behaviour. My hackles had risen. I sensed immediately that something was off. Normally Natalie was the sharp one among us, but I was the only one that had my eye on the ball this evening, and I didn't intend to let it out of my sight. I needed to investigate what was going on. Mrs. Cooper's behaviour was paradoxically enigmatic to me. She had not been angry with us for swimming in the lake. She was fully dressed, wearing sunglasses in the middle of the night. She was holding Claudia Salazar's hand and leading her through the woods, away from where we were camped out in the middle of the night. This was not normal. With my attention alert and every hair on my head standing up on end, I discreetly followed Claudia and Mrs. Cooper into the woods, after grabbing my torch, but I failed to put on my sneakers in time, which was a big mistake. It was so dark under the shaded canopy of the trees, so much so that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. So I was stumbling around awkwardly in the dark, like a blind man, very nearly tripping over jagged rocks that were jutting out of the soil like sharp teeth. I was too afraid to switch on my torch, in case I drew attention to myself. Luckily Claudia had her torch on, and it lit up the way ahead of me, so it was easy to see where she was going with Mrs. Cooper. I could not for the life of me understand why they were walking so deep into the heart of the woods together. What the hell was Mrs. Cooper up to? All of a sudden the tuneful trills of the crickets and frogs became mute. Everything became very quiet, which affirmed to me that something was definitely amiss. I gasped with relief when some generous trickles of moonlight suddenly projected their way through the forest canopy, so I could see so much more clearly. It was incredibly awkward to walk on my bare feet down these less than friendly footpaths. I winced in agonizing pain as a couple of thorns pierced through my heel. At this point my heart was beginning to wilt in my chest, rather like a dying flower, for I felt that something was terribly wrong. I just knew this in every single fibre of my being. I think Mrs. Cooper must have sensed my presence, for she turned around very suddenly, and was looking directly at me. She removed her glasses from her eyes, and that was when I saw the vindictive yellow eyes staring at me, the same eyes I'd seen the previous night from the woods, when I was swimming in the lake. Then I knew that this woman who claimed to be Mrs. Cooper was not our English teacher at all, but an impostor that had managed to mimic her with some kind of shape-shifting techniques. So I cried out, "Get away from her, Claudia! This is not Mrs. Cooper you're with! Get away from her! She's tricking you! Get away from her, Claudia!" In that poignant moment, things happened far too quickly for comfort, because Mrs. Cooper, who wasn't Mrs. Cooper, growled at me contemptuously. And that growl, it wasn't human. Suddenly Mrs. Cooper dropped the holographic projection she was wearing as a disguise, and in a trice I saw what was really hiding behind her mask. It was a monstrous beast of a creature, covered in shiny dark brown hair. This huge, gargantuan creature looked to be a cross between an otter and a human being, which is the only way I can describe it to you. But this thing, whatever it was duplicitously cunning, as it had successfully lured Claudia away from the lake, and deceived her. When Claudia realized she'd been taken in by this hideous thing, she tried desperately to break free from the creature, but the creature began to hold her down, and his grip on her was steadfast. "Let me go! Let me go!" she cried out. She glanced at me with a desperate pleading look on her face. "Help me, Philippa! Help me!" she cried out. The creature simply threw Claudia on his back, like a sack of potatoes. Claudia was screaming, as this otter-like creature began running through the grove. I tried to pursue the creature, I really did, shouting after him, "No, let her go! Please, don't do this, don't do this!" At this point my feet were literally shredded. They were so cut up, and there was blood everywhere. I tried desperately to chase after this creature, but it was no good. I could never even get close to it. It ran away so very fast. With a heavy heart I returned to the lake. My friends, believe it or not, were still there drying themselves when I reached them. They had been chatting together, but stopped talking at once, almost as if sensing something was terribly wrong. I began to gasp for breath as I tried to tell them the horrifying truth about what had happened to Claudia Salasai, but no words came out. "What the hell is the matter with you, Philippa? You look as if you've seen a ghost. Are you all right?" asked Natalie, her face growing deep with concern. Finally I managed to say, It's Claudia. It's Claudia." "What about Claudia?" asked Natalie, her jaw beginning to tighten, as she sensed what I had to tell her was not going to be good. "She's gone!" I cried out. "I don't think she's ever coming back. We're never going to see her again. No one will ever find her." "What the hell do you mean, Philippa? You're not making any sense. You're not pulling my leg, are you? Because if you are, I don't find this funny. Not at all." Finally I managed to regain my composure, although how I did I can't be sure. I'm not joking, Natalie. Claudia's gone. I don't think we'll ever see her again." "What the hell are you talking about? You're scaring me half to death. I saw Claudia moments ago with Mrs. Cooper. Now you're saying she's gone? You're not making any sense at all. That you don't understand. That wasn't Mrs. Cooper you saw. It was something pretending to be Mrs. Cooper. They could speak and act like her and look like her. But it wasn't her. It knew things, like Claudia's surname and I think things about us. I don't know how. It has powers. It's evil." That was when I informed my horrified friend about the giant Ottoman I'd encountered, and how it had snatched Claudia away, running with her into the heart of the woods, and how it had shape-shifted in front of my very eyes, and then I'd seen what it really was, and it was the scariest thing I'd ever beheld. Those yellow eyes had been absolutely haunting. "But that can't be," said Natalie. "Monsters aren't real. We believed in them when we were kids, didn't we? But what you're describing sounds so fictitious." "I don't know what this thing was," I explained. "It was huge, standing up on two legs like a man. It had a massive tail like an otter. It did look to be a cross between an otter and a man. That's the only way I can describe it. That's why I'm calling it an otterman." As my friends appreciated the gravity of what I was saying, it hit them really hard. Tears spilled down their cheeks, and we all began to weep. They, of course, knew that chasing after a creature such as this was a fruitless expedition. But we still had to alert the teachers to tell them what had happened. And if my friends were struggling to believe my account, how would the teachers even react? Natalie took charge and said, "I think we should only speak to Miss Greenwich about this. I don't want us to share these startling revelations with Mrs. Cooper. She'll never believe a single word of it. I know she won't. She says she's got an open mind about ghosts, and maybe that is true. But I rather think she'll draw the line if we tell her a big creature, that resembles an otter and a man, took Claudia away. We need to speak to Miss Greenwich. She's a lot more open-minded about things like this. You've known her for years, Philippa. She'll know you're not making this up." The three of us were in such a dreadful state. So with our hair still wet and still sporting our swimming costumes, we set back to camp, our hearts heavy with grievous despair, and a vacuous sense of emptiness. It was still very dark outside, cloyingly so, and was at a guess probably about 1:30 in the morning. I was the one that ultimately led the way to the teacher's tent to get help, although I knew unequivocally there was nothing we could do to help Claudia now. It was all too late for that. "Miss Greenwich! Miss Greenwich!" I called out. I could hear a groan in the tent, a shuffle of material, which I assumed was a sleeping bag. There was a movement as if someone was getting up, and thankfully I heard Miss Greenwich tell Mrs. Cooper she'd get it. All I can say is thank God it was Miss Greenwich and not Mrs. Cooper that poked her head out of the tent. I could see the woman was only half awake. She wiped the debris of sleep away from her eyes, and I wondered with a very broken heart how she was going to react when I told her the story that would sound so implausible and far-fetched. "This better be good, girls," said Miss Greenwich, understandably sounding a little grumpy. She glanced over at us with an expression of confoundment on her face, as she suddenly realized we were not wearing our pyjamas. "Look at you! You're wet! You're all wearing swimming costumes. Don't tell me you've been swimming in the lake, without any supervision in the middle of the night. You know you're not allowed to leave your tents unless a call of nature demands your attention. But you've dishonoured the rules. You've been swimming. Why would you do this? Sometimes I really despair with you girls. I'm grateful I don't always know what goes on behind my back, or I think I would quite literally have a heart attack," she said, suddenly clutching her chest tightly. Finally she said with a big exasperated sigh, "What was so important that it couldn't wait for the morning?" she asked, her pale blue eyes fixing steadily on me, as if in some way she knew that I was the one that was equipped to answer this question for her. "Miss Greenwich," I said, lowering my voice into a muted whisper, in the beleaguered hope that Mrs. Cooper, who was obviously asleep in the teacher's tent, did not overhear our conversation. "Miss Greenwich," I repeated twice over. My words sounded so fearful that in that moment Miss Greenwich's blue eyes, that had previously been subdued by a sluggish tiredness, suddenly grew wide with attention. "What is it, Philippa?" she asked, her voice tightening with trepidation. "Is something wrong?" "It's Claudia Salazar, Miss Greenwich." Miss Greenwich's blue eyes, that had previously been subdued by a sluggish exhaustion, suddenly grew wide with attention. "What is this, Philippa?" she said, her voice tightening with trepidation. "Is something wrong?" "It's Claudia Salazar, Miss Greenwich." Miss Greenwich's face grew white, almost as if she knew the news I was about to convey was not good. What about her? Speak up, dear." She was abducted." "Abducted?" gasped Miss Greenwich. "But how do you know? Did you see the man that did this?" "Miss Greenwich, that's it. The thing that took Claudia. It wasn't a man." "It wasn't a man?" asked Miss Greenwich, looking grave. "You're saying a wild animal took Claudia away? Please, God, no," she said, throwing her hand over her mouth. I proceeded to tell Miss Greenwich about the creature that had pretended to be Mrs. Cooper, and how I'd been suspicious because Mrs. Cooper had been acting weird and wearing dark glasses in the middle of the night. I told her how I discreetly followed the creature, and how it had miraculously shape-shifted from Mrs. Cooper into an otter man, and then run off with Claudia so fast that there was not a hope in hell of catching up with him. I then burst into tears. "You do believe me, don't you, Miss Greenwich? I'm telling you the truth, I am." I think this thing is eaten Claudia. It's too late to help her. It's long gone now. I've never seen anything run that fast. What are we going to do? I whimpered. I believe you, dear, said Miss Greenwich. 1000% actually. I've heard of such creatures before. There is a name for that creature. I wish I could remember it, but I just don't. I do know things like this exist, and they're very clever. They have shape-shifting techniques. They use this to lure their prey. You're right. It is too late to help Claudia. Far too late, I'm afraid. But what are we going to do, Miss Greenwich? We are going to call the sheriff. But you cannot tell him, Philippa, what you have told me. He'd never believe a single word of it. Never. Do you understand that? He'd think you had made the whole thing up, and that would make you look very suspicious, as if you had something to hide, and you were making up a very unlikely story. Well, what are we going to tell the sheriff? I asked. You are going to tell the sheriff what you told me, Philippa. But you can say you don't know who her abductor was because you didn't have a good look at him. It was very dark. Is that understood? It's a reasonable thing for you to say. No one would doubt your word on that. As you can imagine, in no time at all the sheriff had been notified. Everybody was roused from their tents, still wearing their pyjamas, their hair tousled, eyes heavy with sleep, only to be met by flashing blue lights, a plethora of police cars. So confounded and confused were the anxious voices from the girls in my ear, all asking what on earth was going on, and why the hell were the police at our campsite, in the middle of the night like this. To all intents and purposes, Mrs. Cooper was not handling herself at all well. She was overwrought with emotion. Miss Greenwich, on the other hand, remained dignified, attentive and calm, which was why she'd always been such a good matron over the years. Mrs. Cooper appeared to be beside herself with grief. She was terribly upset with us, in particular me, for not abiding by the rules, and for leaving our tents in the middle of the night for a swim. She began to flap around like a bird with a broken wing, looking flustered and very disgruntled. What on earth is wrong with you, Philippa? She said, doggedly focusing her formidable attention directly on me, as if in some way she saw me as the instigator of this daredevil swim at the lake that had ultimately led to Claudia's abduction. She pointed an accusatory finger at me and said, Well, I hope you're proud of yourself, young lady. I cannot believe you had the blatant audacity to go swimming in the lake in the middle of the night like this. None of this would happen if you had stayed in your tents as you were supposed to do. But no, you couldn't help yourself, could you? Any opportunity to break the rules, and you will take it, won't you, Philippa? The sheriff, having overheard Mrs. Cooper going off in a tangent at me, came over to rescue me from the firing squad of her accusations that were being launched at me indiscriminately. To be fair, I guess I had claimed to see the abductor running through the woods, so Mrs. Cooper invariably thought I was the one that needed to be seriously reprimanded. So there we are. That is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.